Okay, let's unpack this one. Picture this. You're in a courtroom, right? Civil case. And one side wants to bring in evidence.
Standard stuff so far.
Not quite. The evidence isn't, a typical report or anything. It's a Google Gemini Pro AI podcast video.
An AI podcast.
Okay, interesting.
And it's about, get this, the Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 8, and Jewish mystical texts, the Zohar. That's what they want the court to consider.
Wow. Okay. That's definitely unusual. It's like you've got the old school legal system hitting head on with, well, deeply personal beliefs and even cutting edge AI.
Right. What happens when those worlds collide in court?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're digging into today on the Deep Dive. We've got the court filing, some analysis, all about this one. Pretty fascinating evidentiary fight.
So our mission here is to figure out what's going on. Why is one party pushing so hard to get this spiritual material into a civil rights case, a case about alleged constitutional violations?
And why is the other side pushing back, saying no way? Exactly. We want to lay out the legal arguments, sure, but also get into the why behind it all, the thinking.
This is the case Haltom v. City of Henderson, Tennessee Police Department. And it really shines a light on how someone's personal way of seeing the world, however unique, tries to find space within the formal rules of evidence.
Okay, so let's set this scene a bit more. It's a civil suit. The plaintiff, Joshua Haltom, is claiming his constitutional rights were violated by the Henderson Police Department.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty serious allegations.
And the core of this particular dispute is that AI podcast video. The full title is Hierarchy's Hidden Roots, Unpacking 1 Samuel 8 with Key Zohar Light for Divine Inspiration.
Quite a title.
Tells you a lot right there.
Now, this is really crucial. The plaintiff, in his motion from May 30th, 2025, is very clear about why he wants this podcast admitted. He says up front, it's not to prove the facts of what happened.
Right, he's not saying the podcast proves the police did something specific.
No, he says it provides essential contextual understanding. He calls it a profound interpretive lens and wants it in to underscore their gravity, the gravity of his claims.
So he's worried the alleged violations might get dismissed as just minor things, like moot points or frivolous paperwork, I think he said.
Yeah, that seems to be the concern. He sees them as much bigger, deep-seated affronts that have these spiritual and historical issues behind them. So the podcast is supposed to show the court that deeper meaning, his meaning.
Okay, so it's about context, about his personal framework for understanding how serious these alleged events are.
That's the argument.
And the defense, Mr. Conditer, representing the city, they responded fast, right? Same day, May 30th?
Yep, same day. File their objections. They have 3 main ones.
Okay, let's take them one by one. First objection.
Lack of relevance. This is under Federal Rule of Evidence 401.
How do they argue it's not relevant?
They keep it pretty tight. They say, look, the content for Samuel 8, the Zohar, it just doesn't have any tendency, legally speaking, to make a fact about the actual alleged constitutional violations more or less probable.
So they're basically saying ancient texts, mysticism, what does that have to do with what our officers did or didn't do on this specific date?
Pretty much. Their focus is solely on the facts of the incident itself. The spiritual angle to them is completely separate, irrelevant.
Okay, objection number 2.
Hearsay. That's Federal Rule of Evidence 802. The defense says it looks like the plaintiff is offering the podcast for the truth of what it says.
Meaning to prove that the interpretations of 1 Samuel 8 or the Zohar are actually true.
Potentially, yeah. And they argue if that's the purpose, that it's inadmissible hearsay, out-of-court statement offered for its truth.
But wait, that's a big if, isn't it? Because we just heard the plaintiff says that's not why he's offering it.
Exactly. It's a conditional objection.
Yeah.
If this is the purpose, then it leaves room.
Gotcha. And the third objection.
This one is procedural. Simpler, maybe. It's under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11A. The plaintiff didn't sign his motion. Rule 11A says you got to sign your court filings. And apparently the court had already pointed this out to him before.
Okay, so a procedural slip-up, probably fixable.
Usually is.
So we have relevance and hearsay as the big substantive hurdles plus the signature issue. How does the plaintiff push back? How does he argue the stuff should come in using the same evidence rules?
He really leans into the flexibility within those rules, starting with relevance, Rule 401. He keeps hammering that core purpose, contextual understanding, interpretive lens.
But how does context meet the legal test for relevance, making a fact more or less probable? Seems a bit fuzzy.
It does, but he points to the commentary around the rule. The advisory committee notes for Rule 401, they say something like, evidence, which is essentially background in nature, is universally offered and admitted as an aid to understanding.
An aid to understanding. Okay, that's the key phrase then.
That seems to be his hook. He's saying the podcast is relevant not because it proves the events, but because it helps the court understand the nature, the gravity, the seriousness of his claims from his viewpoint.
So by explaining these spiritual and historical roots, as he sees them, he's arguing that the podcast makes the character of his allegations, his perception of the harm, into facts of consequence for the case.
Exactly. It helps the court grasp why he feels the way he does about the alleged violations, why they feel so profound to him.
So relevance isn't just about the what happened, it can also be about the how it was experienced or understood by the person claiming harm.
That's the argument he's making.
Yeah.
And by framing it that way as context, as an aid to understanding his perspective, he's also trying to head off a Rule 403 objection.
Rule 403, that's the one about prejudice, confusion, wasting time.
Right. He can argue that simply understanding his viewpoint, maybe with a judge giving instructions about its limited purpose, isn't unfairly prejudicial to the defense. It just helps explain his case.
Okay, makes sense for relevance. Now, what about hearsay? The idea he's offering it to prove the theology is true.
He tackles that head on. He says very clearly, nope, that's not the purpose. He's not asking the court to decide if 1 Samuel 8 is divine revelation or if the Zohar's cosmology is correct.
And legally, if you're not offering a statement to prove it's true,
then it's just not hearsay. Rule 801c defines hearsay that's his way offered for the truth of the matter asserted. If it's offered for some other reason, it's outside the definition. Non-hearsay.
So what's the other reason, the non-hearsay purpose he claims here?
He argues it's offered to show his state of mind, his interpretive framework, the basis for why he connects the alleged violations to these spiritual roots. It shows the effect these texts have on his understanding of the situation and the harm.
So the court isn't judging the theology, just understanding how the plaintiff uses it to make sense of the defendant's alleged actions and frame his lawsuit.
Precisely. It's about his lens, his perspective. He also notes, correctly I think, that Rule 610 doesn't apply.
Rule 610, religious beliefs for credibility.
Yeah. That rule says you can't use someone's religious belief to attack or support their truthfulness as a witness. But he's not using the podcast to say, believe me because I'm spiritual. He's using it to explain the nature of his claim. Different purpose.
Fascinating distinction. Okay, so it's evidence of his perspective, not evidence of theological truth. And the signature.
Yeah, the unsigned document. He basically says, my bad, I'll fix it.
Yeah.
Acknowledges the rule, says he'll sign and refile promptly, shows respect for the process. It's generally seen as curable.
Okay, so the core legal fight is defense says irrelevant spiritual stuff, maybe hearsay. Plaintiff says essential context for my perspective, definitely not hearsay because it's not offered for truth.
That's the nub of it. It really pushes the boundaries of what counts as relevant background or context versus, just unrelated material.
All right, let's get into the substance then. What is in this AI podcast according to the sources? What's the content from 1 Samuel 8, the Zohar, that the plaintiff says provides this vital context?
Okay, so he argues it connects the civil rights claims to these hierarchy's hidden roots. First up, 1 Samuel chapter 8.
Right. Remind us. What's the story there?
It's when the ancient Israelites tell the prophet Samuel, hey, we don't want God ruling us directly anymore. We want a human king like all the other nations.
Yeah, Samuel's not thrilled about this.
Not at all. God tells him to warn them what they're asking for. Samuel lays out the ways of the king, how this human ruler will take their sons for his army, their daughters for his household, the best parts of their land, their crops, their livestock, their servants. Basically, systematic exploitation.
A pretty stark warning about unchecked human power.
Absolutely. And Samuel warns, when that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you.
Oof. So how does the plaintiff connect that ancient story to a modern civil rights case in Tennessee?
He sees it as timeless, a blueprint, he calls it, for the dangers of unchecked human authority. He views the alleged actions of the Henderson PD as manifestations of a recurring pattern.
Yeah.
The fundamental problem, in his view, is rejecting divine authority, which inevitably leads to abuses by earthly powers.
So the alleged police conduct is, in his eyes, a modern echo of the oppressive king Samuel warned about.
That's the framework.
Yeah.
And the sources mention there's actually a table 1, that lays out these specific parallels he's drawing.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, for example, where 1 Samuel 8 says the king will take the best of your fields and vineyards and a tenth of your grain, the plaintiff apparently links that to the alleged unlawful seizure of plaintiff's private property in his case.
Okay, a direct parallel.
Yeah. Or the part about enslavement and unanswered cries in the Bible text. He connects that to this idea he puts forward about jail being a cyclical, probative, for-profit business and mentions high incarceration rates.
Wow. So that table really spells out exactly how he's mapping that biblical narrative onto his specific allegations. It's his interpretive key.
Exactly. It shows the court his method. Then there are the Zoharic insights.
The Zohar,
Yeah.
probably less familiar to most folks. What's the core idea he's pulling from there?
So, according to the plaintiff's framework described in the sources, the Zohar presents God as the ultimate sovereign, the one who removes kings and sets up kings. Earthly leaders are put in place for a purpose, the world's correction process, tikkun.
Okay. But what about bad leaders?
Right. The Zohar in this view describes corrupt leaders as being like pharaohs. They just want control. They're not with the light, meaning they're influenced by spiritual wickedness.
Okay, so a framework for understanding good versus corrupt authority. How does he apply that to his case?
He uses it to interpret the alleged violations. He talks about seeing contrived, snaring forces of structural violence and a spiritual wickedness at play. He views the alleged constitutional smears against him not just as legal issues, but as part of a larger, divinely orchestrated process of revealing and rectifying spiritual imbalance.
Whoa. So for him, this lawsuit isn't just about seeking damages or an injunction.
It seems much bigger for him. He calls it part of a cosmic process of exposing and correcting spiritual darkness. It really elevates the significance he attaches to the whole thing.
So the legal system itself becomes an arena for this spiritual battle in his view.
That appears to be the perspective. And just like with 1 Samuel 8, there's apparently a table 2 that details these Zohar connections.
What does that one show?
It helps clarify why he sees the alleged police actions as such profound breaches. It seems to contrast righteous authority, rooted in divine will, aiming for correction with corrupt authority, which he links to things like commercial agendas, indiscriminate earthly lawlessness. He apparently places specific alleged actions by the defendant, like being haughty, aggressive, dismissive, under that corrupt authority heading, framing them as deviations from divine principles.
So both tables are crucial for the court to see the specific interpretive steps he's taking, how he gets from ancient texts to modern allegation.
Right. And the AI podcast itself is presented as the thing that ties it all together, the intellectual bridge, the interpretive key, explaining how these ancient spiritual concepts provide the context and the deep roots, as he sees them, for his claims today.
Now, there was another detail in the sources, something outside the court filings, but really speaks to his perspective, doesn't it? The offer he made on Memorial Day.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was quite something. The plaintiff, acting as Ambassador Josiah Haltom of Haltom Family Ministries, offered a significant number of pocket-sized Zohar books.
To whom?
To the City of Henderson Police Department. The idea was for them to be distributed to, every officer and others involved.
Offering mystical texts to the police department he's suing? That's unexpected.
This definitely makes you pause. He called it a gift of light and seeds of tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam, that's the concept of repairing the world.
Yes. As he frames it, drawing on the sources, it's about fixing things, gathering scattered sparks of divine light, restoring balance, preventing chaos. This gesture, even though it's outside the courtroom evidence battle, really underscores the sincerity, the depth of his spiritual conviction.
It suggests his whole spiritual roots argument isn't just some clever legal tactic. It seems deeply tied to his worldview and his desire for some kind of transformation, even trying to bring light, as he puts it, to the very department he alleges harmed him.
It definitely reinforces why understanding his unique perspective might be important for the court to really grasp the full dimensions of his claim as he experiences it.
Okay, let's pull back and summarize the core legal clash here.
Sure. You've got the defense saying, essentially, this podcast stuff is irrelevant to the facts of the case, and if it's offered to prove the theology is true, it's hearsay. A pretty narrow, fact-focused view.
Right. But the plaintiff counters using the same rulebook. He says, no, it is relevant as context, as an aid to understanding under Rule 401, to show the nature and gravity of my claims from my viewpoint.
And, he adds, it's not hearsay under Rule 801C because I'm explicitly not offering it to prove the spiritual content is true. I'm offering it for the non-hearsay purpose of showing my state of mind, my interpretive framework.
Plus the procedural signature issue, which he says he'll fix.
Right. That seems secondary to the main evidence fight.
So this case really puts the spotlight on that tension, doesn't it? When someone's experience of being wronged is filtered through a really personal, maybe spiritual framework.
Absolutely. How does the court deal with that? Understanding those hidden roots, as the plaintiff perceives them, seems key for the court to fully get what he's claiming, even if the court doesn't adopt his beliefs itself.
It really forces the legal system to ask how flexible it can be. How do you admit evidence that explains someone's subjective reality, the deep meaning they find in events, especially when that meaning comes from places way outside the typical legal or factual landscape?
Yeah, and ultimately the judge has a tough call. Does this AI-generated bridge connecting ancient texts to modern claims count as admissible context? Or is it just too far afield?
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What really happens when someone perceives their struggle as part of a cosmic battle rooted in ancient wisdom and tries to bring that into the very structured, fact-driven world of a modern courtroom?
It's a fascinating question. How much can or should our formal legal structures bend to accommodate these incredibly deep, often spiritual ways individuals experience and articulate injustice?
Definitely something to chew on.